welcome. My name is Hannah Norberg, and I am one of the co-founders of the Trade Policy Research Forum, together with Ben Shepard, who is in the background here today, because today we happen to have our very first guest star moderator. So Michael Ferrantino, who is our esteemed advisor. You can read all about our advisors on the website, is taking the lead here today and has put together this amazing seminar on what the role is for trade policy in time of conflict. And we'll be looking specifically at sanctions. So for those of you who are new to the to the TPR Forum, very, very welcome. And welcome to those of you who have been here before too, of course. This is our goal here, is to bridge the gap between trade policy researchers and policymakers, and researchers within different areas. And we are available on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the website later on, together with the presenters' PowerPoints. So in case you want to catch up on anything. Let's see. All right, come on in, everybody. Welcome. So we have 3 speakers here today, and so it's a packed schedule. So the way but still we want to make sure that the forum gets to be a forum here, and that everyone here speaks, and we get the comments and questions from everyone here. So please use the Q&A or the comments box as we go along, and post your questions and comments there. Now, we do realize that this is a very hot topic, and some might have high emotions around this. So we would just like to remind people to be civil and polite and friendly here. And if you're not, then you will be removed from the conversation. As always, at the Trade Policy Research Forum, we are friendly and supportive, and we are here to learn and get to know facts here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for having us all. And I think some people coming into this topic will say, well, sanctions were a fringe topic. We didn't learn about this in the school, but I'm interested in it now because it's coming up in the news and current events. What I'd like to remind people is that in some sense, if you go back far enough in the history of international trade policy, sanctions was the core topic. It was more important than the tariff. If you take the mercantilists seriously, and not, again, as you learned in school, to dismiss them as a math error that David Hume, proved away, but as living in their own world, that the main purpose of trade policy was to weaken and cripple your enemy at war. And they thought hard about how to do that and what the mechanisms of that were, and to just look at how seriously economists took this in earlier generations. Eli Heckscher, who is primarily known for a set of theorems about factor intensity, that wasn't the core of his career. He was an economic historian who wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages on mercantilism, including a wonderful book, which is in the public domain, I recommend to people, called The Continental System. And the Continental System is about the trade policy tactics that Napoleon and the British used against each other in the Napoleonic Wars. Not only the not only the sanctions, but the evasion of those sanctions, and both the imposition and the evasion of sanctions actually turn out to have a great deal of drama and cloak and dagger to them, as has been picked up in the literary community. If you have read any of the Master and Commander novels or C.S. Forester's novels about Horatio Hornblower, you are dropped into this wonderful 19th century world of sanctions. And if you're not familiar with Hornblower, I will just share with you that Gene Roddenberry says that said that the characters of James Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard, the starship captains, were based on Hornblower, who was trying to figure out how to prevent shipments from getting through to the French. So now we're in this world where sanctions are seen often as an alternative to war, but still, as we're seeing in the current events with Ukraine and Russia, can be entangled with the same. And we have three, I think, very interesting speakers. Erdal Yalcin has been part of the putting together of a very large database on sanctions, not only how they operate, but their outcomes, which I think a lot of researchers are going to use. Zoe Liu is looking at the question of payments mechanisms, in particular, how one can evade the various networks that look at the dollar. And Maksym Chepeliev is looking at a very practical case. What would happen if the developed countries in Europe specifically simply quit buying Russian natural gas and oil? And this sort of gets to part of the heart of one of these cases. Not only how do these very elaborate things operate, but what economic effect is there both on the sender of the sanctions and on the target. We hope that you enjoy the discussion. Each of the participants is going to try to express their extensive body of thinking in 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up. And I'd like to begin with Erdal.
Thanks a lot, Hannah and Michael, for the kind introduction and the invitation. As you said, it's a hot topic. Hannah mentioned it already, but it's also not a new topic, as Michael mentioned it. So the intention I have is in the next 10 minutes to basically create kind of a level playing field, if you want so, based on the database Michael mentioned, the so-called Global Sanctions Database, a project I will get into in more detail during the presentation. But so sanctions are at the moment very prominent also media-wise, politically, not least because of the Russian war. But before showing you how the sanctions over the last decades have developed, I want to start with a completely different chart, namely with conditions enabling at least economic sanctions. Here I have a graph, a time series, which trade economists consider to be the openness measure. Basically, what we measure here is the export and import volume relative to the national GDP. That's kind of a measure of openness of a country. And to be more precise, the black line here, for example, is for Germany, this openness measure. And as you can see, Germany has increased its export and import share relative to the GDP continuously over the years. And one can interpret this very simple measure in such a way that for each dollar that Germany is creating in value, 80 cents of additional export and imports are taking place, meaning this figure nicely illustrates in a very simple way that we have an increasing cross-border interaction along the national economic growth of countries. And there are two important messages. So globalization since the 70s was continuously increasing until 2010, as you can see also for China and on average for the world. And however, after 2010, Germany seems to be more or less kind of an exception. On China, for example, still with the workbench in terms of global trade, started to grow faster domestically. And on average, the world is also no longer integrating as fast as it was before 2010. But the message is we have an increasing interdependency economically. And this opens up the possibility to utilize economic dependencies by using sanctions. Now, just to have the same definition, what are sanctions? There is no clear definition, but a very general way to interpret the term is we are talking about politically motivated restrictive measures basically applied either by individual countries or groups of countries or by the United Nations in order to address violations of international norms or national interests, political interests. And the main objective behind these restrictions are to induce a change in the behavior of the targeted country. So with this definition, as you all know, at least through the media, sanctions have been on the rise. I'll show you that with descriptive data. So the UN sanctions have increased. The Russian case is very prominent. Iran has been very prominent. And but the question for us as economists has been basically what are the trade effects or the economic impact of politically motivated sanctions. So in order to analyze this, we didn't want to, when we started with our project, we didn't want to go case by case. Our approach has been also in the tradition of this general equilibrium approach, more comprehensive approach. Is there a kind of a common average effect that we can identify? And for this, you need appropriate data. And it turned out when we started the project to understand sanctions better from a trade perspective, there was not a real long-term comprehensive data set. There had been data sets by Gary Huffbauer from the Patterson Institute, by Cliff Morgan, but for our purposes, having a bilateral and also distinguished types of sanctions, the data was missing. So we started with colleagues from the Drexel University, Yoto Yotov, Konstantinos Suriopoulos, and Alexandra Kirilaka, and also with Gabriel Felbermeier, who is in the Economic Research Institute in Vienna, the president, to collect data. Collect data spanning the years 1950 to 2090, and we will publish an update until 2021-22 in the next month. And this so-called global sanctions database gives a very comprehensive overview how sanctions, bilateral sanctions, multilateral sanctions have developed over time with respect to different types of sanctions and also the extent of sanctions, meaning complete versus partial sanctions and directional effects. And based on this database, which you can basically also ask for on this internet site, Global Sanctions Database, I want to just give you some stylized facts. Now, how did sanctions develop or have been developing since 1950? So the first panel here on the left shows the annual number of sanctions in place. And as you can see, there is a continuous rise in sanctions. This is the first message. And then the left panel, these are annually observed additional new sanctions. And what we see is, particularly after 2010, there is a significant acceleration in imposed sanctions. And remember, in my first graph, in terms of global openness, in the same period, we also observe a slowdown in global cross-border trade, for example. So there seems to be, at least in this anecdotic way, a relationship between increasing political interventions by sanctions and a slowdown in globalization. Now, we can distinguish, if we zoom into the numbers, there are different types of sanctions, as I mentioned. So here I show you how the number of different types of sanctions over the years has been changing. And as you can see, in the very beginning of our data set in the 50s, trade sanctions still represent the largest share, followed by arms sanction. Also, with Michael's introduction, like trade and arms issues have been at the core in the very beginning, also in the post-World War II period. But there is a fundamental change in the distribution, as you can see then, particularly starting in the 70s, but in the last years, financial sanctions and travel sanctions start to increase. And one can summarize this in a graph by having shares. You can nicely see that trade sanctions have been the bulk, more than 50%, for example, of observed total sanctions in the 50s. And this has changed. Today, still they have a significant share, but financial sanctions turn out to be the most important share. Somehow linking this to the integration argument, the financial integration, of course, has been significantly faster than the trade and real economic integration of the world, as a side remark here. Now, another graph here, what I show you is, in this circle, I have basically shared the world into regions, and you can see here arrows indicating, for example, in the year 1950, that a large share of sanction within Northwestern Europe have been taking place among the countries in that region. And this is not surprising because we had the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, and there was a confrontation between democratic Western countries in Europe and the Eastern countries. Now, just taking the same regions, in 2019, these interdependency and the extent and also the variation of sanctioning countries by regions is exploding. So the sanctions have been used by much more countries against much more regions from their own destinations. And at the end, again, coming to my first slide, with a growing globally integrated world, we also see a kind of confrontation across borders, meaning there is the precondition: if economic integration takes place, then the likeliness of sanctions, politically motivated sanctions, obviously increases. The nice feature of the global sanctions database is that besides identifying sanctions, we are able to identify also sanction-specific objectives that are declared in the documents which we collect. And there are 8 important categories which we have identified. So policy change, regime change, territorial conflicts, war-related issues, terrorism, but then very important, human rights and democracy-related objectives. What you see here very nicely again is, looking into the 50s and 60s, you can see that regime change and political destabilization of regimes has been the core share of sanctions. And this, however, changes starting in the 70s. And more recently, with this acceleration, we see that democracy and human rights related objectives are dominating modern sanctions. And that's very important to emphasize it. While taking about a policy change, you want to have another president or prime minister or a party in a country. That's a very more or less clear argument. But democracy and human rights objectives are much more complicated in terms of capturing the framing of this objective. So for example, what you'll find on the web page of the Global Sanctions Database, together with the colleagues, we also utilize this database using advanced typical estimation methods, the gravity model, the structural gravity estimations, in order to quantify average effects of sanctions, for example, on bilateral trade. And one important result is that in case of bilateral comprehensive trade sanctions, it is possible to reduce trade by around 88%, according to the empirics. And just to translate this, in order to achieve the same effect, countries would need an equivalent tariff of around 30%. But we then also zoom in, for example, in idiosyncratic cases, like for Iran, we found out that even so there is this global yuan sanction, only 55% on average trade has been reduced in that country. And one aspect that we work out in these papers is there are, in most cases, countries that do not participate in sanctions. Even so, they voted, for example, for sanctions. They just circumvent sanctions and just trade, like, for example, China and others, to name big players. Now, it's very important for me, and that's the punchline of this little presentation. What I can say and what we find out is sanctions can be very effective in terms of economic damage. So that's something which descriptive statistics and also empirically estimated results indicate and support. Just to mention the example of this 88% on average for all sanctions, trade sanctions. So there is a effectiveness. We call this effectiveness, but we should be very clear that it's something different to talk about political objectives and the success of sanctions in achieving these political objectives. Now, the last important aspect of the database is we also have some indicators to assess the success of the defined objectives. Here I show you only one descriptive figure where we categorize the success into total, partial, or failed, and you can see here that on average, across the different types of objectives, around 30 to 40% a success rate can be observed. And this is more or less in line with other existing literature, just to name one like Gary Hufbauer, who worked also on this. But there is a big but. When we see these numbers, first of all, these are very different cases, different countries, and there are confounding factors. Just to give you a last example, if you think of the invasion of Iraq, the war in the Gulf, there were sanctions imposed against Iraq, but the US had also a massive military intervention. So disentangling the success from other factors is a highly challenging aspect. And this is an ongoing research project also in our group by a colleague. But I want to mention here, if we discuss also later, for example, Russia, economically, sanctions can be very successful. In terms of political success, this is a very difficult issue. I think this is good framing and summary. Thanks a lot at this stage.
Thanks much. That was a great place to start, Erdal. What I'd like to do, we're starting to get questions coming in, both broad questions and technical ones. I'd like to give all three of the presenters a chance before we start fielding things. So, so let's hear from Zoe.
Great, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be invited. It's great to see Michael, Hannah, and Ben. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing my screen, fingers crossed. Hopefully my updated version of Zoom would work. Is it working now? Still no?
No, no, sorry.
Okay, so let me try this. There is something like, would this work?
There's a glitch here. I'm going to suggest that you just talk with us, okay, and sure, that you can you share it with us later. Yeah, sure,
that sounds good.
If you so yeah, for all of you, if you email over the presentations, I'll be then putting them up on the website.
It's fine.
For the recording.
On my end, it's totally okay. I think, I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations. We are being trained to do presentations without a PowerPoint. So, like along the spectrum of doing presentations, there is the version of, Department of Defense. You just go anywhere with, you cannot go anywhere without a PowerPoint. But we are on the other extreme, which is, we are not allowed to use PowerPoint. which is fine on my end. So, but my talk today is going to be about why, you know, a lot of these sanctions on Russia in particular have been inevitably driving China into the conversation, in the sense that people are thinking that China's payment system, or the so-called cross-border interbank payment system, may become a tool or provide Russia with a lifeline, helping Russia to bypass sanctions. So my talk today is going to be less about how sanctions can be evaded, but I wanted to convey the message why China's CIPS cannot help Russia bypass sanctions, or at least for now. So my content, the discussion of my conversation would be focusing on two broad things. One is I want to give you a general sense of the dollar's dominant currency status and why it matters. And then I'm going to start launching into the explanation part of why China's CIPS cannot help Russia, right? So in my my research on can BRICS de-dollarize the global financial system was published by Cambridge University Press right on the day when Russia invaded Ukraine. And then people started to ask me questions in the sense that, you know, what does this mean to the dollar's hegemonic position, and so on and so forth. So there is a very broadly established literature talking about the dollar's dominant currency status. And in my research, I sort of just visualized, I draw like a polar style chart to show these are the specific areas in which dollar's dominant currency status reside. And more specifically, I categorize it into, broadly speaking, three areas: the real economy, investability, and funding. So in the real economy side, you know, it includes things like global reserves, SDR, the SDR basket, trade invoicing, and commodity pricing. Then there is the last part that I consider as very important is the payment infrastructure. And here in the payment infrastructure part, people tend to think about, you know, the fundamental or the critical part of SWIFT. But now we all know, you know, what SWIFT is. It is, you know, very humble messaging system. It's basically a protocol enable global banks to be able to talk to each other. So the power of the dollar's sanction mechanism really reside into, on the one hand, the information flow, which is initiated through the SWIFT system. But then the other part that is critical is the settlement system, which is, you know, the so-called Fedwire and the CHIPS system. So in other words, a lot of this thing, for the dollar's sanction to be implemented, you need information flow and capital flow, right? So the part that makes people tend to think China's CIPS system or the cross-border payment system is important, is because it is different, or it is not just a simple mimic of the SWIFT system, in that it's not, the focus of the Chinese CIPS system is not about messaging. It is about messaging plus settlement. In other words, it not only sending messages between banks, but also consolidate or make the settlement at the same time. And in many ways, we can think about the Chinese the Chinese or the renminbi cross-border payment and clearing system enabled by, on the one hand, the CIPS system, and then coupled with China's domestic or the national advanced payment system reside inside China's domestic market. And then on top of that, there is also the SWIFT system, in the sense that, you know, a lot of the Chinese banks, they are, especially when they are doing international cross-border transactions, they need to talk to international banks. And because you know, the latecomer of the CIPS, and basically it is going to be a hard sell for China or the PBOC or the Chinese banks to tell JP Morgan, tell, you know, Bank of America or Citi to say, hey, how about you just adopt our protocol? No, they're not going to do that, right? So basically what ends up happening is that the CIPS or the Chinese system, when it comes to messaging protocol, it is still enabled by the SWIFT system. Now, what ended up happening was after the threatening of kicking Russia off from the SWIFT system, after Russia's taking over of Crimea in 2014, people started to think about, you know, the vulnerability of the Chinese system. Therefore, alongside, in addition to the SWIFT protocol, the CIPS system started to develop their own domestic messaging system. So it is in this sense, people think that, well, it seems that this is a pretty good mechanism that might allow Russia to tap into the Chinese CIPS system and then evade sanctions. In other words, we are literally talking about replumbing the global financial system through, in times of, the SWIFT messaging system is no longer working. Now, the limit of this part resides in two areas. On the one hand, the CIPS system, yes, it has grown tremendously over the past 3 years in particular, and there are a lot of indirect participants as well as direct participants. But if you look at how many of these, there are 70-something direct participants, meaning there are domestic and overseas institutions that have CIPS code. They can directly handle the cross-border RMB payment and settlement through the CIPS system. But out of these 70 plus banks or direct participant, 35 or so, they are overseas Chinese banks. In other words, they are not truly international. So there is a limit. And then on the other hand, in order for the CIPS to allure or to increase its attractiveness, it still needs to rely upon the intercommunication with the SWIFT system. In other words, it is in terms of sending message around, despite it can handle settlement onshore. In order to get international banks, like more banks participating into this system, you rely upon the SWIFT system, which is the cost of entry in many ways, or the dominance of the incumbency, right? And then finally, in many ways, there is the last part that is very crucial is the nature of the renminbi itself. As long as you have capital control, the attractiveness of this settlement system, payment and the settlement system is going to be limited. Now, has China been trying to be, or the PBOC in particular, starting from 2018, because of the deterioration of US-China relations and all that, has China or the PBOC been thinking about how to reduce their vulnerability? Yes, they have. And the SWIFT also realized the potential for CIPS becoming a proprietary independent system. So what ended up happening so far has been SWIFT has been giving CIPS and the PBOC a sort of like a helping hand, engaging with the CIPS system in the sense that I'm going to help you build your system so that you are using my code. And then on the other hand, China has been with the SWIFT help, China has been launching a domestic or onshore data storage system, meaning not only the settlement and the messaging is conducted within the Chinese system, the data is also stored onshore. In other words, going forward, there could be this potential of a completely isolate or avoiding sending the transaction mechanism to the United States. And that would be achieving the goal of cutting information flow, hence avoiding sanctions. But as far as today, the capacity of the Chinese cross-border payment system is still very limited in terms of scope, in terms of participant, and in terms of renminbi's capital mobility. So that's why my core message here today is, if I were Russia, I would not count on the Chinese to help me out.
Got it. Okay. Great. And then finally, let's hear from Maksym.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present our work here. And so in this particular presentation, I'll talk about a very specific case of sanctions that has not actually yet been fully imposed, but are in discussion. So restrictions on Russian energy imports by EU and other OECD countries. And this is a joint paper with my colleague from the GTAP Center, Dominique van der Broek and Tom Erdal. So to start, when the invasion of Ukraine started, EU and other OECD countries started to impose and restricting sanctions on Russia, starting from financial sector, targeting specific individuals, service sectors, and also some countries started to target a very sensitive item, in particular energy goods. And So energy revenues are about 1/3 of Russian budget. So restricting these particular flows could be particularly harmful for the Russian economy. And EU contributes about half of all this revenue. So when we look into the distribution of imports across different energy commodities by EU, we see that, of course, there are quite large variations. In some cases, like natural gas, overall dependency shown here in blue bars is somewhat lower. For petroleum products, it's higher. When we look into dependencies, it's important to take into account what is also the domestic production. So when we take this into account, we see that the dependency somewhat decreases, but it's still very high for crude oil, for instance, almost 28%. And it's very different from cases of UK or US who have already banned imports of Russian energy commodities, since their dependency is much, much lower than the EU. So in general, the stakes for EU are much higher. We also see that not only EU aggregate is heterogeneous in terms of energy commodity import dependency, but when we look into the selected countries on the right side of the screen, you can see that it's mostly Eastern European and Baltic EU member states that have the highest level of dependency on Russian energy imports. So for these countries, their potential stakes are higher than, let's say, for Germany, which is widely discussed in the press. It's also worth noting that in value terms, oil and petroleum products, which are relatively easier to substitute than natural gas, constitute around 65% of energy imports from Russia in value terms. So we also see that feature in terms of, and that's one of the reasons why in the next package of sanctions, EU is currently discussing to imposing restrictions on imports of the oil commodities and petroleum products. So what we have done in this paper, which I should also mention is forthcoming in the World Economy Journal and has been published as a short version in Vox EU and also has been presented in the European Parliament back in March. So what we do here, we apply a general equilibrium modeling framework, the one that, for instance, Erdal was referring to in his presentation. And we look into several scenarios of the impacts of banning Russian energy imports by EU and most OECD countries. And we consider both short and long-term implications of this step, since these are like very different timeframes. In the short run, there is a limited possibility of substituting energy imports across sources. Substitution across energy commodities is also limited. In the long run, we have a pretty different story where the substitution possibilities are much better. So the impacts would be also different. And what you can see on this slide are, so the three scenarios we consider, they differentiate across different level of restrictions in terms of energy imports. So we look into 80, 90, and 99% restriction of imports from Russia. And on the right hand of the slide, you can see the macro estimates of the corresponding impacts in the short run. So what we observe is that we estimate that this restriction would result in increasing energy prices for EU consumers somewhere between 8 and 11%, and the real income could fall by up to 2%. So it doesn't mean an absolute reduction, but a decline in the growth rate. Yeah. So if the projected real income growth rate, let's say, was 4%, with the complete ban, the growth rate would be around 2%. Now, there are a lot of other things going on, and I'll discuss it later in the presentation. So this should be also considered in the context. But these estimates of income or other studies also report GDP decline are consistent across several other studies available there, like Bachmann and colleagues and others. Yeah. Okay, so apart from their impacts on the EU itself, since we notice the heterogeneity in terms of energy consumption patterns across countries, and B, also consumption pattern differences across different household types. So what we also look into is how these measures might have different impacts across different EU countries. And what we see here on the with household expenditure shares are different across different EU member states. So remember the chart with the list of countries that are kind of the most dependent on energy imports from Russia. And most of these countries are also presented in this chart with the highest share of household expenditures on energy and transportation. So for instance, according to our estimates, Bulgaria has the highest share of total household expenditure on energy and transport, around 15%. And as a result, restricting energy import would hurt this country kind of the most adversely. So, a projected increase in consumer prices could be up to 1.4% compared to an EU average of somewhat lower than 1%, 0.8%. And we see that there is this important feature of heterogeneity across EU member states. And that's one of the points why it's important to coordinate the efforts in terms of energy volume exchange and in terms of storage, and that's what we currently see is being discussed in EU. Now, another important point in terms of impacts is how this could impact different household types. So we know that lower income households, they tend to spend more on energy, yeah? And focusing on the Bulgaria as potentially the most impacted country, what you can see on this slide are shares of different household expenditures split by income quintiles. So the lowest quintile is kind of the poorest, quintile 1, and the highest is the richest quintile. So what we see here is that the lowest quintile in Bulgaria spends around 14% of their budget on energy, while the highest quintile spent less than 8%. So the same increase in energy prices would impact kind of the lower income households more adversely. So we estimate that lower income could face an overall price increase in the consumption basket of around 2%, while the highest income households increase for them would be much lower, around 1.4%. Now, to put these price changes into the context of historical deviations, what we see here is that if we compare 2021 prices with 2011, we can see that in 2011, energy prices were like almost 60% higher than in 2021. So, and even in 2011, Bulgarian households were spending only less than 13% of their budget on energy. So these currently observed price increases are consistent with what has been seen historically, but of course they are observed at a much shorter time period. So the shock kind of is sharper in this regard, but at least it shows the opportunity of households to adjust to this level of price shocks. Now, as usual, in the case of any policies, there are winners and losers, yeah? So EU as an imposer of sanctions and the largest consumer of Russian energy commodities would be kind of impacted the most adversely, apart from Russia, which we will discuss later. But what we see here is that there are the large energy exporters, such as countries in Europe and Central Asia, for instance, Kazakhstan, MENA region, rest of high-income countries, so Norway is included here, they would benefit from these sanctions due to A, rising global energy prices, and B, partial substitution of the imports that EU would be cutting from Russia. And this substitution can be seen on this chart on the right. So we see that overall imports of energy commodities by EU reduces, but it's partly substituted by imports from other energy sources, from other destinations. Okay, so far we have discussed the short-term impacts, but whereas the substitution possibilities are relatively limited, and that's why we have been observed largely adverse impacts. But what would happen in the long run, where we have a better substitution possibilities? Where
Maksym, I'm very sorry to break in here. We're running out of time, I'm afraid. So if you could
just 2 more minutes, okay?
Yes, that's excellent. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. So what we see in the long run is that we see the reductions in, we see that the sanctions would reduce the demand for energy, fossil fuels, and this would result in reduction in emissions. So both CO2 and also air pollutant, which is an important source of mortality in EU. And we estimate that this would allow to go halfway to reach the EU Green Deal target in terms of emission reductions. And it's also equivalent to €40 per ton carbon price in the long run by 2030. Yeah, so this is an important step in terms of reducing emissions. So what about impacts on Russia? We estimate that the impacts would be on average like 10 times more in relative terms than on EU. Yeah, and again, this is consistent with other studies. So even taking into account potential substitution of exports to other destinations from Russia. Now, the last slide before I conclude, and I have seen also a question in the chat. So why do we see an increase in revenue in terms of trade for Russia? Well, yeah, we also looked into what's happening in reality. Yeah, so we have here analyzed only one part of the story, but there are also other market distortions and which are intersecting with these sanctions. So what we have seen since 2021, there has been 45% increase in oil prices. Natural gas prices have increased over 60%. And the price pressure has been mounting even prior to the war, so during 2021 and early 2022. OPEC, partly this has been because OPEC has not reacted in terms of increasing supply. So essentially the supply from OPEC has been fixed, very slightly increasing, and that's why we have been observing this much higher price pressures than one would expect. There are also some specific in terms of electricity pricing in EU, so clearing by highest bidder. So essentially natural gas power generation drives the market. There are also some non-targeted support measures in EU, like price caps. So this restricts demand reaction. So households kind of do not reduce their demand if price is capped, and it pushes further their prices. So as a result, we see the combined effect of all these measures has increased energy prices, and Russian revenue from fossil fuel export during the first 2 months of the conflict has essentially boomed, because this price increase has overstated the reduction in energy exports. And the projected for 2022 is that Russian budget would get 30% more revenue in energy exports. Should it stop EU from imposing sanctions? Well, definitely not. So we see that in the short run, there might be some adverse impacts. There would be these price reactions and increase in EU budget, in Russian budget revenue. But in the long run, we see that impacts would be as one would expect. The costs for EU are relatively low, but of course the coordinated efforts across EU are needed to deal with the technical restrictions. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. Really, really interesting presentations. Michael, I wonder where you went. Michael seems to have fallen off the grid.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, not a problem. So I see we've got a lot of questions in the chat. There are a number of technical questions for Erdal on the database, and I suggest that people approach him bilaterally. I am going to ask one, though. When you scored that a sanction was successful or partly successful, how did you go about doing that?
And that's a very good point. Basically, there are hard facts which you can identify, like a territorial conflict or a war, but then there are these soft objectives, which I mentioned, democratization and human rights issues. And what we did so far is we have screened systematically media databases where we look for high-ranked political representatives of sanctioning countries and sanctioned countries, and look for a statement that the sanctions have been successful in achieving a specific objective defined or partly successful. So this is a very soft measurement, but it is a starting point. Of course, you can always say there is a bias. Politicians may be tempted to exaggerate the success or underrate the success, but at least it gives us a first indication. When we communicate this very clearly and describe this in the paper where the data is described.
Okay, thanks. That is very helpful. For Zoe, I'm seeing a question on how the BRICS countries can combat the weaponization of the dollar. And I've seen this phrase, and honestly, as a layperson, I'm a bit confused about how the dollar gets weaponized, because there's dollars floating all over the world. And this is what I sort of imagine. Let's suppose that I'm a drug dealer in country A, and I wish to buy weapons from somebody in country B. And we both agree that we'd like to do the deal in dollars, possibly because the arms dealer wants to, buy a Netflix subscription or something. I don't know. So aren't there just enough dollars floating around in the world that this can happen just outside of the reach of the Treasury or the Federal Reserve?
Michael, that's an excellent illustration. When you are using the example of, drug dealers, whether it's in Mexico or in Southeast Asia, my example would be, a legitimate sovereign state. For example, Saudi Arabia. There have been discussions talking about Saudi Arabia using renminbi to take their oil payment. And, in many ways, when we talk about de-dollarization infrastructure, there has been a renminbi that does launch its own renminbi-based oil futures. In many ways, it can facilitate de-dollarize the global commodity trade in one market after another, let's say, right? So that basically means for a lot of these people, I would say countries, sovereign states develop this kind of alternative transaction mechanism, not because they want to do this, but really because of the fear of being cut off from global liquidities. And it's more like we are buying insurance. We buy insurance not necessarily because we really want to use it, but in many ways, really, hoping that we will never use it. And President Putin, he himself actually did say, it's not that Russia is willing to develop its own SPF system or the Mia card. Russia didn't even have its Mia card until after 2014, right? So it's a lot of this pressure pushing them around. And in many ways, I think why I think the end of the dollar is not necessarily going to end with a boom or like something just stop suddenly, like the music chairs and suddenly stop. It's because basically we have this like a marvelous American advanced weapon system, and as long as countries are willing to pay for it, you have to use dollar as the invoicing currency. And then in terms of illicit market, there are also things related to digital transactions and things like that. So go back to your point. Yes, I think the dollar, there are a huge amount of dollar floating around. It's going to be difficult to challenge the dollar in many ways, but countries challenge the dollar not necessarily because they want to.
Yeah, thanks. So Maksym, so as a good modeler, you present several levels of your shock. There's a substantial one, and then a higher up one and a severe one. As I follow the news, I see that the EU is trying to get consensus on an oil embargo, but that they're not talking about natural gas yet. So would we be right in thinking that if they implement everything that they've discussed, that we're still not yet up to your lowest scenario?
Well, one particular reason they are not talking about natural gas so far is because it's the hardest one. Yeah, in terms of the markets are very segmented. It's much harder to substitute than petroleum products. So that's one of the reasons. Now, in our scenarios, we were sanctioning all commodities, but a different level of kind of import restrictions. So, for instance, in the lower scenario, we were sanctioning at 80%, but all commodities. So in this regard, it's not kind of, so we did not go commodity by commodity, but more like uniform shifts in restricting all commodity imports. My answer is it's not kind of directly comparable, but the idea was to give kind of the upper bound estimate of what can happen. Yeah, and we also see a lot of other things are going on. If I may also add another comment, I see there was a question regarding any changes in the model closures that we used for the short-term versus long-term scenario assessment. And one particular change we did for the short run, we reduced the trade elasticities to mimic the lower possibility of substitution across both sources of imports, but also energy substitution.
Yeah, so these sources of Russian fossil fuels, you rightly built in that these would be difficult to substitute away from, and especially for the natural gas. I also wanted to ask about the way that you relate this to the environmental policy and the price of carbon. So there are a whole army of people who've been studying the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, all of which was largely designed before the war. And the way that that is designed, as I understand, is that there's no carbon tax imposed on imports of oil and natural gas. It is all on goods downstream, like steel and chemicals and so on. So doesn't that suggest that, regardless of how much it might be desired to punish Russia right now, isn't there a deep reluctance to actually just cut these flows?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. In a sense, although you doesn't seem to lose too much, for instance, from the partial oil embargo, from imposing tariffs on oil, that has been shown in numerous studies, there is just a political reluctancy. And that's partly because in the case, for instance, of Germany, from the very beginning, there was a huge lobby from industrial producers, chemical producers, metal producers, that any bans would just crush the economy. The economy would fall by 50%. And that message was also kind of conveyed through their governmental representatives. And only after that, modeling estimates and research scientists started to kind of jump into the dialogue, showing that, well, there are multiple channels that would A, allow you to substitute, B, there are price effects, C, you can support households that are in need, and so on. So the picture is much more complicated. And when you take all this into account, the impact's actually not so dramatic. And that's kind of started shifting the dialogue somewhat, but this kind of interaction between industrial lobbies, government, and researchers, that's something in the center of this kind of decision making. Yeah.
So when you told the Committee of the European Parliament that the pain might not be so great if they went down this road, were they surprised?
Well, so what we tried to do there, this was a round table, so we collected a number of estimates from different modelers, and we put together a table showing that there is not a single model that would show a collapsing of the economy due to this embargo. Yeah, so even the highest estimates were like 3% of GDP, like this level of estimation. So and hopefully after that, the European Parliament in 2 weeks, they made a resolution on the support of banning energy imports. So hopefully that has somewhat shifted the debate.
Yeah. I'm going to have to jump in here, Michael, because as we say in Sweden, wonderful is short. Boring lasts a long time. And this was wonderful, and it was too short. And we're actually out of time. And since we're, people have come in here to catch it, then I feel bad for them if they have to leave and we didn't finish the call. And you guys are also super busy, so we need to let you go. So I was going to just do a really quick roundup as we let you go. So for the policymakers who are on this call, what is Erdal, you did it already in your presentation, but if we can just summarize it, go around the table. We'll start with you, Erdal. What is your main message that you want to send across?
Well, we are going to see, obviously, more sanctions. This is something I have indicated, and this is concerning for me. We, as a child coming from a liberalizing decade, 2 decades, now we are sliding into a more protective, policy-oriented protective time, and that will create a lot of challenges, a lot of restructuring in global economy. So these will be challenging times.
Thank you. Also, I think about removing the sanctions once you have gotten the goal in place, right? That's also very difficult to do. Zoe, what's your elevator pitch to policymakers listening?
I would echo what Erdal Yalcin just mentioned, and I just wanted to say, in many ways, the people think about current debate always tend to pull China into the conversation. On the one hand, it demonstrated that China has been on the receiving end of the sanctions. China has also been exercising sanctions, whether it is Norwegian salmon, Australian lamb, or wine, things like that. So in many ways, the rise of China's influence in global payment infrastructure does not necessarily pose a direct threat immediately, but it laid down the long-term de-dollarization infrastructure. And in many ways, it is a critical mass problem. As Michael said, right now there are a lot of dollar floating around, but it does not necessarily mean the dollar's dominant currency status should be taken for granted. So, I would want to put a cautious kind of message, send a cautious message to Congress. Don't abuse sanctions.
Don't abuse sanctions. Okay, Maksym, what's yours? What's your closing?
Okay, I'll talk a bit broader. So just avoid making speculations in terms of the impact of sanctions. So first properly assess them, with the proper tools and then make decisions. But on the other hand, models are very limited. So be aware of their limitations and what they can capture, what they can't capture, and all the other things that are going on and interact, as we perfectly see in the case of, energy sanctions. Yeah. Always
a great reminder. Michael, thank you so much for coming in here to be our special guest star moderator here today. Thank you so much for being our advisor. And so for everyone who is on the call, your contact information is out there. They're on your presentation. So for people who want to continue these very, very interesting but too short conversations, that's all right, right? For them to reach out. Excellent. Okay. And we already, before you guys go, we have lined up a really good presentation for June. I think Ben has it on a slide. Let's see. Yes. We're going to get Daria from the World Bank to do US-China trade war and global reallocations. And we also know that we will be doing supply chains in July. So without further ado, thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you so much for your questions and comments and for your presentations. It was an honor and a pleasure, and we learned so very, very much. Have a great day. Thank you.